In the quiet suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Pines, residents prided themselves on orderly lawns, neatly painted fences, and an unwavering dedication to HOA rules. Every inch of property was scrutinized, every minor infraction documented, and every conversation tinged with the subtle reminder that someone was always watching. Among the most watchful was Karen Monroe, a woman whose name was whispered with exasperation by neighbors and dreaded by anyone who crossed her path. She was the type of person who carried a clipboard during her evening walks, scribbling notes about lawns that weren't trimmed to her liking or trash bins left out a few minutes too long. Her presence was overbearing, but tolerated, because no one wanted to be the next target of her passive-aggressive letters and formal complaints. For most people, Karen's antics were a nuisance. But for one homeowner, Mark, the situation took an outrageous turn. Mark lived in a corner house with a wide driveway and a double garage. And unlike most neighbors, he actually used his garage for what it was meant for: his car, his tools, and his personal belongings. It was his space, private and secure, or at least it should have been. The discovery came one Friday evening when Mark returned home from work, tired and ready to unwind. He pulled into his driveway and immediately noticed something odd. His garage door was slightly ajar. At first, he thought he must have left it that way in the morning, but that idea dissolved as soon as he stepped inside. There, parked neatly in the middle of his garage, was a silver SUV that didn't belong to him. Karen's silver SUV. His own workbench was shoved to the side to make space, his bike awkwardly leaning against the wall, and her vehicle sitting like it owned the place. The gall, the entitlement, the sheer audacity of it was staggering. No note, no permission, no explanation, just her car, inside his private garage. The pieces fell together quickly. Karen's driveway had been partially blocked by street repairs that week, and she had clearly decided that Mark's garage was the perfect solution. She didn't ask. She didn't care. In her mind, the HOA's self-proclaimed queen could do whatever she pleased. Mark stood there, staring at the sight, and a slow, calculated sense of anger began to burn inside him. He wasn't one to start conflicts, but he also wasn't the type to allow someone to stomp over his boundaries. The HOA might bow to Karen, but his home was his fortress, and now she had violated it. That night, instead of confronting her, he formulated a plan. He knew Karen would expect him to roll over, to allow her behavior, maybe even to apologize for inconveniencing her. But Mark had something else in mind. A quiet, devastating retaliation that would teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. By the time he locked the garage door and went inside, the first step was already clear. He would leave things exactly as they were. He would let her think her actions were acceptable. And then, when the timing was perfect, he would strike back. The idea of what he would do next simmered in his mind all weekend, each hour sharpening the details of the plan until it gleamed with precision. This wasn't just going to be a confrontation. It was going to be a story Karen would regret starring in. And it all started with a simple decision. He would not be the one to move her car. The following morning, Karen strutted across the street with her usual air of self-importance. She wore oversized sunglasses and carried herself like she was the president of the entire neighborhood, rather than just the loudest voice on the HOA board. She waved at Mark, as if her parking inside his garage was no more controversial than borrowing a cup of sugar. Mark responded with nothing more than a nod, concealing the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Inside, he was already setting his plan into motion. After confirming that her SUV was still inside his garage, he closed the door, slid the heavy bolt lock into place, and pocketed the only key. The echo of the metal lock snapping shut was more satisfying than he expected. It was the sound of control returning to him. Karen didn't notice at first. She came and went throughout the day, assuming she could retrieve her car whenever she pleased. But that evening, when she strolled over to fetch it, she found herself locked out. She tugged at the handle, pressed the keypad on the side of the frame, and frowned when it didn't budge. Her SUV was trapped, and for once, Karen was powerless. Mark watched from his living room window as she paced back and forth, muttering to herself. He could almost hear the indignation rising in her voice, the disbelief that someone would dare deny her access to something she had taken without permission. But he didn't move. He didn't explain. he simply let her stew. The true beauty of his plan, however, came the next morning. While Karen was still fuming outside, Mark loaded his suitcase into his car. He had already arranged time off from work, purchased tickets, and set his home's security cameras to record every corner. With a deep breath and the satisfaction of a man about to deliver poetic justice, he pulled out of his driveway. He wasn't just going out for the day. He was leaving for 10 full days. 10 days of vacation, 10 days of Karen's SUV locked inside. His garage, 10 days of her forced to explain to the HOA why she was suddenly carless. It was a revenge so subtle, so perfect, that it didn't even require confrontation. All it required was patience. As Mark's car disappeared down the street, Karen finally realized what had happened. Her SUV wasn't just parked in someone else's garage. It was being held hostage, and there was nothing she could do without exposing herself as the one who trespassed first. The war had officially begun. The first 2 days of Mark's absence were almost comical. The cameras he'd set up captured Karen pacing in front of his garage, tapping her foot and craning her neck as if sheer indignation might force the lock open. By the third day, her frustration began to spill into the neighborhood. She started stopping neighbors mid-walk, gesturing toward Mark's house, and telling anyone who would listen that she had been wronged. But the story she told was carefully curated. She didn't admit that she had helped herself to his garage without permission. Instead, she claimed Mark had offered her temporary use while her driveway was blocked, then suddenly changed his mind and locked her out. She painted herself as the victim of a bizarre act of hostility. Some neighbors nodded politely, though most exchanged knowing glances. Karen's reputation preceded her, and very few were convinced. Still, she persisted. By the 4th day, she escalated matters to the HOA board, demanding an emergency meeting. She stood before them with her usual bluster, holding printed evidence of her driveway being under repair, as if that justified commandeering someone else's property. Her words were sharp, her tone righteous, but her problem had a glaring flaw. She couldn't prove she had permission to park in Mark's garage. She had no text messages, no written agreement, nothing but her own word, and her word was worth very little. The board members, weary of her constant crusades over lawn heights and fence paint, listened with forced patience. A few even smirked as she tried to spin the story. When the HOA refused to intervene, Karen's frustration grew into fury. She stormed away from the meeting and decided to take matters into her own hands. That night, under the cover of darkness, she returned to Mark's garage with a set of tools. Cameras captured her fumbling with the lock, tugging at the door handle, and even crouching low to peer into the crack at the bottom. But Mark's precautions held firm, and all she accomplished was making herself look increasingly desperate. By the 6th day, the neighborhood was buzzing. Gossip spread quickly in Oakwood Pines, and soon nearly everyone knew that Karen's SUV was locked inside Mark's garage. Parents whispered about it while walking their kids to school, and joggers slowed down just to peek at the infamous garage as they passed by. Karen's embarrassment grew with each sideways glance and muffled chuckle. Her next move was to escalate beyond the HOA. She called the local police, insisting that her property was being illegally detained. When the officers arrived, she marched them straight to Mark's garage, gesturing dramatically as if she were unveiling a crime scene. But once again, the facts were not in her favor. The officers reviewed the situation, noted that the garage belonged to Mark, and asked the simplest of questions. Why had she parked her vehicle there without permission? Karen sputtered, deflected, and attempted to spin her tale again, but it crumbled under the weight of scrutiny. The officers left with little more than an amused shake of their heads, reminding her that trespassing into someone else's property wasn't a wise strategy. By the 7th day, Karen's desperation was no longer a secret. She had tried gossip, the HOA, attempted break-ins, and even the police. Each failure only added to the spectacle, and Mark's locked garage had become the centerpiece of the neighborhood's quiet amusement. What Karen didn't know, however, was that Mark had planned his return to coincide with the peak of her frustration. And when he walked back through his front door after 10 days away, he found the perfect storm waiting for him. When Mark returned from his vacation, sunburnt but satisfied, He wasted no time reviewing the camera footage. For hours he watched Karen's antics, her pacing, her arguments with neighbors, her late-night attempts to pry open the garage. Each clip was more incriminating than the last. The footage wasn't just entertaining. It was evidence. The first thing he did was back up every file. The second was to unlock his garage and finally free her SUV. He didn't leave a note, didn't announce his return. He simply rolled up the door and walked away, allowing Karen to discover her car was accessible once more. When she did, her relief was overshadowed by humiliation. By then, the neighborhood had seen enough of her flailing to know the truth. Conversations that used to stop when she approached now carried on without her. Neighbors who once nodded politely now crossed the street to avoid her. The power she had enjoyed as the self-appointed HOA watchdog was slipping through her fingers. But Karen wasn't finished. She decided the only way to regain control of the narrative was to double down. She marched door to door, explaining to each household that she had been the victim of harassment. She claimed Mark's actions were cruel and vindictive, and that he had endangered her by keeping her SUV locked away. She even hinted that she might pursue legal action. Yet, with every repetition of her story, the neighborhood's patience grew thinner. Some laughed openly at the idea of suing someone for protecting their own garage. Others asked pointed questions she couldn't answer. Why hadn't she asked permission? Why did she think she had the right to use someone else's space? Why was she trying to break into his garage in the middle of the night? Her credibility crumbled, and for the first time in years, Karen was no longer the one controlling the whispers and complaints. She was the subject of them. Mark, for his part, remained silent. He didn't engage, didn't confront, didn't need to. The beauty of his plan was that it required no explanation. The evidence spoke for itself, and the neighborhood had already drawn its own conclusions. The final blow came at the next HOA meeting. Several residents, emboldened by Karen's loss of authority, stood up to air their own grievances. They spoke of the petty violations she had written them up for, the constant surveillance, the endless nitpicking. They used her garage debacle as proof of her hypocrisy, and the board listened with unusual interest. By the end of the meeting, Karen was no longer leading the conversation. Instead, she was on the defensive, sputtering excuses while others rolled their eyes. The balance of power had shifted, and for once, she was the one facing the cold shoulder of her community. What had begun as a small act of revenge had snowballed into something much larger. Mark hadn't just gotten even. He had exposed Karen for who she truly was. And now, the entire neighborhood was watching her unravel. But Karen was nothing if not persistent. Her pride wouldn't allow her to retreat quietly. And as Mark would soon discover, she was preparing one last desperate move to claw back her reputation. Karen's pride was wounded, but not destroyed. After weeks of being the subject of gossip and ridicule, she became determined to reclaim her throne as the enforcer of Oakwood Pines. To her, reputation was power, and power was something she could not live without. The SUV incident had stripped her of credibility, but Karen believed she could spin her downfall into sympathy, if only she could paint Mark as the true villain. So she devised one final plan, one she thought would restore her standing. She would accuse Mark of harassment and bullying, using the garage debacle as her evidence. She began with carefully crafted letters, slipped into the mailboxes of every resident. Each one accused Mark of being aggressive, manipulative, and potentially dangerous. She claimed she had suffered emotional trauma from being locked out of her own vehicle and suggested that Mark had intentionally isolated her. She even hinted that she was seeking legal representation. The letters had the opposite effect she intended. Neighbors read them, shook their heads, and shared them with one another in disbelief. Some laughed at the melodramatic language, while others rolled their eyes at the audacity of a woman who had parked in someone else's garage without permission. Instead of turning them against Mark, the letters reinforced just how detached from reality Karen truly was. When the letters failed, Karen escalated again. She began staging dramatic scenes in front of Mark's house, loudly announcing her grievances whenever anyone walked by. She gestured wildly at his garage, declaring that she had been trapped and targeted. She even went as far as to call for the HOA to take action against him for what she described as emotional abuse. But the more she protested, the more absurd she appeared. Residents began filming her rants from their phones, sharing clips in private neighborhood group chats. Her image as the all-powerful HOA watchdog was reduced to a meme, and her antics became a source of amusement rather than fear. Still, Karen pressed on. At the next HOA meeting, she delivered a lengthy tirade, demanding that Mark be fined, penalized, or even removed from the community. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed her words still carried weight. But when she finished, silence filled the room. Then, one by one, residents began speaking out, not in her support, but against her. They recounted years of her harassment, from citations over lawn ornaments to complaints about children playing too loudly. They used her garage stunt as the ultimate example of her hypocrisy, a story that had already spread far beyond Oakwood Pines. By the time they were done, the board was faced with a clear choice: continue enabling Karen's reign of terror, or finally put an end to it. For the first time, Karen found herself cornered. Her voice cracked as she tried to regain control, but it was too late. The neighborhood had turned, and the board had grown tired of her endless crusades. They voted to remove her from her self-appointed compliance committee position, stripping her of the little power she had clung to for years. Karen stormed out of the meeting, her face flushed with rage. It was her last stand, and she had lost. What she didn't know, however, was that Mark wasn't finished. He had stayed quiet through the chaos, but now, armed with undeniable evidence, he was ready to deliver the final blow. Mark had watched the entire storm unfold with measured patience. From the moment Karen parked in his garage, he had anticipated her reactions, her denials, her attempts to twist the narrative. He knew her pride would not allow her to back down, and he let her dig her own hole deeper with every outburst. Now, with her influence crumbling, he was ready to end it. At the next HOA meeting, Mark arrived with a simple flash drive. He waited until the floor was opened for new business, then stood and addressed the board. He explained calmly and without exaggeration that his garage had been entered without his permission and used without his consent. He didn't raise his voice, didn't embellish. He simply presented the facts. Then he played the footage. The screen. Neighbors watched Karen stroll into his garage, park her SUV, and walk out as if it were her own. They saw her return days later, tugging at the locked door, rattling the handle, and pacing furiously. They saw her crouched in the night with tools in hand, attempting to break in. Each clip landed like a hammer strike, undeniable and irrefutable. The room was silent. Even those who had already suspected the truth were stunned by the clarity of the evidence. Karen, seated near the back, paled as the reality of her exposure settled over her. Every excuse she had made, every letter she had written, every accusation she had thrown, it all collapsed in an instant. When the footage ended, Mark simply said that he had locked his garage to protect his property while he was away on vacation. He had never touched her vehicle, never damaged it, never once acted outside his rights as a homeowner. The board members nodded, their expressions grim. The decision was unanimous. Karen was formally censured by the HOA, prohibited from holding any future board or committee positions, and issued a written warning for trespassing on private property. The same neighbors who once tiptoed around her authority now avoided her entirely, their patience finally exhausted. In the days that followed, Karen's presence in Oakwood Pines dwindled. She no longer patrolled the streets with her clipboard, no longer barked at children riding bikes, no longer sent letters about lawn heights. She retreated into her own home, curtains drawn, her reign of petty tyranny over. Mark, meanwhile, returned to his quiet life. He didn't boast about his victory, didn't rub it in. He simply enjoyed the peace that came with knowing Karen had finally been neutralized. His garage was once again his own, his boundaries respected, his reputation intact. The neighborhood, too, seemed lighter. Without Karen's constant watchful eye, residents felt freer, more at ease. Conversations at block parties no longer circled around complaints and citations, but laughter and shared relief. The community had been given a second chance to breathe, and Mark's silent revenge had been the catalyst. In the end, Karen had parked in his garage without asking, assuming she was untouchable. But by locking the door and leaving for 10 days, Mark had done more than inconvenience her. He had exposed her, humbled her, and changed the balance of the neighborhood forever. For Oakwood Pines, The story of the garage would be retold for years to come. And for Karen, it was a lesson she would never forget.